don't have to just listen to me this morning. I have a team of friends here that are going to share with us. We're going to do a panel discussion about shame because we have been talking about shame for the last few weeks. That's the Peter Pan. Assume the Peter Pan stance. Looking for lost boys to bring them home. Shame is like a fire that can blaze through your life. And we are called to fight against shame, and we're called to fight alongside one another. This means that because shame has a social context to it, healing will also have a social context to it. It will necessitate vulnerability and sharing with others and confessing your sins and even your issues and your shame that may not even have resulted from your own sin, but it's shame that you've picked up in this crazy world we live in. And shame affects all of us. And so the part of the goal of this series is to raise our awareness and for us to help us understand where it is that it intersects our life. It might be as simple for you as those lies that you hear in your own mind. You're not good enough. You're not strong enough. You're not smart enough. You're not a good enough parent. See, everyone else doesn't have that problem. And that accusing nature of that internal voice, whether it's your own voice coming into alignment with the enemy of your soul that's trying to use shame as an emotional tool to try to get you to sin and to feel like your identity is less than what Jesus says it is. And so I have some smart friends here that I've asked to join us this morning. I'll let them introduce themselves to you. If you are new and this is your first time and you're going, what? You need to realize that there are 5 weeks of teaching that have preceded this one. And so you may hear something that doesn't quite seem right to you. Probably if you go back and you can listen to the audio cast or watch the video cast, which, by the way, is much more interesting. You can kind of catch up and see what's going on. All right, so why don't you all introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Linda, and I am not on this panel, but I wanted to be, so I came and sat here. So I just want you to know I endorse this message.
We can't let her leave.
For those of you who don't know, this is my wife, Linda. So we do not have a security issue yet.
Shameless. My name is Scott Bootman. I'm married to this one right here. I agree. I'm a teacher in town, and also I work with the Growing Place, a teen program that they work with. And to put a spin on what Andrew often says, I am a human that was raised among other humans, so I'm pretty well acquainted with shame.
My name is Kaylin Bootman, still married to Scott Bootman, and I am an associate marriage and family therapist at the Growing Place Counseling Center. That is what I do. And this subject of shame comes up a lot in my experiences, so it's kind of fun to work through this and process this as a team. So,
my name is Karma Kamen Goodman. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist for Butte County Behavioral Health. I work in the youth services department, so I get to work with a lot of kids and their families, which is an awesome blessing for me to pour into them all I know from my journey of shame and my walking out of places of a lot of hurt. So yes, I am a human raised by humans. Actually, my mom is in the audience today, so I am really excited that everybody's here. But I like to think of myself, and I want to put this out here for everybody, as an ambassador of Jesus Christ disguised as a marriage and family therapist.
I'm Bernita Woodward, and some of you may remember that you guys prayed for us as we moved to Florida last July, and I haven't moved back, but you will see me some here. And in Florida, I don't have a job, and I don't know anybody, and so I have had lots of time to do a lot of study and research on shame and to get a real clear picture of how it works out in my life because I've been seeing it lots. And also, just this being a human race and living around human, I'm a parent that I'm, really, really glad that my kids have had lots of opportunity to see the places that they need God in their life. Did you catch that?
Yes. Yes.
I'm wishing that I had learned a lot of the ways to motivate my kids in ways other than shame when they were actually still at home.
That's true. I have my own microphone. Thank you.
You don't need this one?
No, I don't.
Oh, thanks.
And this is Veronica Wilkins. She's helping to sort out questions. Right now, if you want to send in a question, there is a number here. This is not my personal cell phone number. Do not contact it in an emergency. It's only for the purposes today, and then that number will disappear. So that's important for you to know. I want to create healthy expectations. I am super thankful to specifically Bernita and Scott and Kaylin, who have actually worked with me for hours and hours and hours on this topic to help me get up to speed, because I know in my job and with my responsibilities, it's oftentimes I need people to help me study because there's so much that we can wade through, and these guys have spent hours and hours and hours. So if you could just thank them on our behalf for what they've done for us. So if you text in a question, your phone number shows, but you're anonymous. Your name doesn't come up. No one's going to think anything different about you in that way. So as we're having some questions come in, I want to ask you to speak a little bit about the fact that shame has a social context to it. Oftentimes in church we think, well, if I can just get prayer for healing, everything's going to be fine. And oftentimes it is fine. But shame is a little bit different. There is a acknowledgement, an awareness, and a together nature to the healing process of shame that's really important. So community becomes key in fighting shame. So can you all talk just a little bit about that, and how does this work out as far as stepping out and fighting shame in a context of community and relationship?
Sure. Well, I think that shame is inherently an internal, personal experience of something that takes place within community, and even just tracing back, if you just think back for a second to experiences of shame in your own story, you can probably go all the way back to maybe even before you could speak. And it was a felt experience perhaps of how somebody was interacting with you, or some way somebody reacted to what you were doing. And the way shame works is it inherently creates a disconnection between people. There's a word that, if you're familiar with him, Archbishop Desmond Tutu uses quite often, Ubuntu. And it's a word that in a particular language means connection or togetherness. It refers, it's hard to translate it into English, but it's essentially that blurry line between me and we. And shame is a really quick way of feeling like that blurry line between myself and everybody else is a really strict line, and that I'm on the other end of rejection, or that to use that as a way of rejecting others. And so inherently, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that is, talks about how one of the ways that we become human, the main way that we become human, is together, and that there are certain things that get in the way of that, like shame, guilt, etc., that we need to be able to work through together within community. In fact, he would go as far to say that to be human in isolation is to not be human at all. It's to be subhuman. And that shame is actually a way of again, separating ourselves out. So in order, just like the wound originally takes place within community, it's through community that wound gets healed as well. Not only with community with one another, but as we all know, with community in our relationship with God, which is often expressed through our community with one another. So,
And on that, I'd like to share a quote taken from The Soul of Shame by Thompson. It says, "Joy is the signature indication of deep, mindful, intentional communication." And shame and joy can't coexist. If shame's driving the bus, you are not going after deep, mindful, intentional connection. Shame thrives in shallow, circumstantial happenstance and isolation. And so if there's a lack of joy in your life, the answer to that is connection. Not just connection, but deep, mindful, intentional connection.
Let's see. Shame and community. I think what's coming up for me is a lot of times our shame is, I don't know, it's manifested like in whatever happens to us in community. And that could be even just at your most beginning relationships, you know, with your parent or with those people, the little kids on the playground, you know, and the messages that they try to speak out over you and your vulnerability just based on your own personality, who you are. Those doors, you know, they creak open and that message gets in, and then you start to doubt yourself, like, you know, you start to think that you're not worthy. You start to think that you're not good enough. And then that just manifests itself in the darkest recesses of your brain. And somehow Satan has a way of reinforcing that stuff. And so it just grows and grows like, you know, just a cancer in there. So to bring that out into the light, they say Jesus is the light, right? We're light in the darkness. And so to bring that out, not only in the light of Jesus, but in the light of believers, it's like what Andrew was talking about, is that as we bring that into the light and our vulnerability, and it's met with empathy by other people, it starts to vanish. It starts to go away. And so community may be the construct that you started to develop that shame, but community is our saving grace. It's like what's going to save our life. And so that's what's so beautiful about this place right now, that we can bring this out into the light and we can really start to talk about it.
That's good. Good. Great questions coming in, by the way. Thank you, as we're wrangling the questions over here. We got a couple questions about identifying shame in your own life. What does it look like? What might be some symptoms that you're actually wrestling with shame? What do you think?
A pervasive feeling of not being good enough, like the constant thought, well, you know, I just can't do that. Or somebody walks by, look at her hair. You know, all these messages that degrade who you are, that do not reinforce the beautiful promises of God, of Jesus. And it just could be this really just this sense of just kind of malaise almost, and not living in that joy like Bernita was talking about. And it's just, you know, it's just feeling like status quo. When we know as believers, like, the fare's already paid, like we can eat from the banquet. And that's what I believe shame feels like for me.
Shame always goes at identity. So shame is going to say, I am, fill in the blank. I'm shame, I'm dirty, I'm scum, I am, versus I have sinned, I have done something wrong. Shame rewrites who we are. So in shame, we focus on the sin as being our identity rather than who the Bible or who God says that we are. And so whenever you find yourself speaking an I am statement, and that what follows doesn't align with who God says you are, there's probably some shame involved there. Also wanted to throw in that sometimes shame comes out not as I'm not enough, but it might come out as I'm too much. I talk too much, I'm too dramatic, I'm too sensitive. So it can be, basically, shame says something's wrong, whether it's not enough or too much. Something's wrong.
Yes, and I would to follow up with that as well. I think shame will define who we are based on something that isn't often who we are at all. So a behavior will turn around, instead of it being out here, it'll turn around and go, oh, you're angry. You want to know who you are? And so I often find that shame will tell us who we are based on things like we do or things that we wish we hadn't, or like Bernita was saying, too much, too little, that kind of thing. And yeah, I find that shame often will tell us who we are based on behaviors instead of, and what it actually creates a dynamic where we can't own what we've done wrong. I think Andrew brought that up, because it makes us bad. So instead of it being, I got angry, oh my gosh, I'm sorry about that, it goes, oh, you're angry? You're an angry person. You're a bad person. And so I think one of the ways that shame, at least in my experience, it will speak is it'll tell me who I am based on something that I've done that I have either think is good or bad, often based, of course, on our value systems and what we've been told. So yeah, I would say shame defines parts of us that.
If you have a thought that says, if that person knew this about me, they wouldn't want to know me. They wouldn't still love me. They would run away. That's probably shame speaking. Shame wants us to hide. Shame doesn't want us to show somebody our real self. So Scripture tells us that our life is hid with Christ in God. We already have a hiding place. We don't need another hiding place. And shame is not a very good hiding place because it shows up. It also shows up in places where it's like, I can't ask for help.
Right.
Or I don't need help.
So can I just jump? The great questions over here. Shame can be healed in community. That's what we're talking about. But what's the balance between depending on Jesus and dealing with it with him, with depending on others in community? That's the question.
I'll try and tie that in with my answer to the last
Go for
question,
it.
too.
Yeah, do it.
We were kind of touching on, I think one of the obvious symptoms of shame in us is it's the areas in our lives where we're most tempted to hide and cover. And this goes all the way back to the story that we have in Genesis. In their shame, they were naked, they were ashamed, they hid, and they covered. It's a message of antipathy. It's a message of anti-empathy. It's a message of anti-love. And so it's the belief that something I am or something I've done makes me inherently unloved. And whether that's with others or with God, it'll usually play out the same way. And so when it comes to our relationship with God and our relationship with other people, much of the way that we play out our relationship with God is through other people. And this is probably why Jesus links the idea of loving the Lord your God with loving one another as yourselves. These two things are inherently connected. I had a friend who once said, and this has stuck with me for years, he said, we have a God who is in the habit of receiving it as worship when we love one another. And that the way that we interact with others, with one another, directly reveals the ways that we relate with God. So back to the original point, I think the most obvious symptoms of shame are that hiding and covering dynamic. Because of that, I won't be loved. I won't be known in this place. Maybe a less obvious outflow of shame is not just hiding and covering, but it's judgment, in fact. And by judgment, I don't mean discernment. We are called to discern things, but I mean condemnation of others. That often comes from areas of shame in ourselves, areas of self-rejection that we then project out into the world. And so I'll stop there because I'm going long, but I'll hand it off.
Say this one really quick, but we all believe that the Holy Spirit lives in us. Jesus lives in us. So one of the ways that we can deal with our shame with Jesus is with one another. And in James it says that if we confess our sins to one another, we will be healed. And so in that, really important thing is if what you want is to dump on someone, that's not what that's exactly referring to. Or if you find yourself a dumping ground, you might want to ask that question, what do you want from this? Do you want to be healed? Or do you just want to dump? That's called boundaries. But when we confess our sins to one another, that is part of the act of dealing with it with Jesus. We are the body of Christ. And walking that out sometimes means being the recipient of someone's confession.
Which is a perfect segue. Bernita, you shared in the first service about you sharing something with your husband, and part of what we're experiencing over here is, and the questions is, give us the detailed examples of how that worked to kind of walk through that moment of shame, if you will. Do you want to tell us that story real quick? That might be the easiest way.
So like I said, I've been getting to walk through lots of shame lessons and dealing with my own stuff, but had an experience where, I have, one of my shame issues is an inability to express anger. And so I have a tendency to stuff it. And then on the other side of that, my husband freezes in the face of anger. And all of that coming from our past, our history. So I had a situation a while back where I was being brave and sharing some anger. And David froze. And so in that space of his freezing and not giving me any feedback, shame was just shouting at me. So in that place of receiving someone's confession, if you're silent, shame's going to speak. Shame's going to be the one left speaking. So there needs to be a voice that responds to someone's confession. You can't just let it hang there, or you're just jumping on the bandwagon of shame and condemnation.
One thing I wanted to add to that, when you said confession, I'm thinking of expression as well. Sometimes people are confessing, but maybe they're just expressing. They're in a place of shame or anger. It's exhibited by anger, but the underlying issue is a shame-based issue, because anger is a secondary emotion always. So it's what's underneath that's promoting that expression of what's going on inside. So, what Bernita is saying is so awesome, is that, acknowledging that, calling out their value in that moment, to say, you're worthy of me to say something to that shame. Because me on the recipient end of it, it may be difficult, but to honor that and to honor that person, and that reinforces their value and starts to diminish that shame. So that's why I love that story so much. And the fact is that we all have messages from our past. What she's saying is, maybe she heard, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it. Kids, they should be seen and not heard. And all these values that we grow up with, that as we're older, as we become adults, we really don't need to hang on to them. We need to figure out what our values are as adults. And so it's kind of like taking ownership of ourselves, but recognizing that my shame could be totally and directly related to that message that's still hanging around in there. And so starting to really take ownership of who I am, what do I value? Who do I want to be in this life for Jesus Christ? And so that's really an interesting concept, is to think that if we speak out for someone against their shame, it starts to diminish that shame.
So I come to you, Kaylin, and I say, I'm wrestling with this stuff. And you are not silent, like we talked about in Bernita's case. And you say something. What are you going to say to me? How are you going to respond to Andrew when he comes and just drops his load of shame?
Well, I think first to listen and to be attentive and to let that person process what they're going through. Of course, we've talked a lot about empathy, so being a person who is connecting with that experience and just really just being in it with them. Even watching, this sounds silly, but like watching your facial expressions can be a very important part of listening, since our bodies obviously speak often what we're thinking. And so I think just being with you in it initially, and then asking questions if that comes up, like how can I help? Kind of like Bernita said, what are ways I can support you? Are there things that you're dealing with that just need a hug right now, like just to really kind of get a good idea of where you're at and what it might look like to sit with you in that for a little while. So yeah, I think initially just really trying to understand, but also sitting in the empathetic experience of it.
Yeah, assuring me that you're not going to leave. You're not going to just say, okay, end of session, I'm out of here, sorry.
Yeah.
Andrew, I don't even want to be in the same room with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And going back to, again, what Bernita said, just to highlight that finding out what that person is looking for, because I think a lot of times we've got, different ends of the spectrum. Some of us might be more on the side of, oh my gosh, I don't want to listen to anyone, shut up, I can't sit with you. And then other people who are like, I listen to everyone all the time and I am exhausted and I feel like I can't ever tell anyone no because I'll shame them or something. And so I think knowing that you can still have boundaries without shame, and you can ask that person, like, what do you need from me? And you then can assess whether or not that's something you can sit with them in, maybe just for that moment that day, or maybe it's a long-term sitting and empathizing and walking with them.
Which is a good segue to another question, is can shame be one and done?
What do you mean?
One and done, and it's dealt with and it's over and I don't have to worry about this anymore.
The enemy is out to get you. And he's not going to stop until you go to be with Jesus. Is it going to be one and done? Mm-hmm. No.
You know what? Gosh, I'm thinking about that question. It's a really, really good one. I would tend to say no, but then on the other hand, Jesus' power is amazing, and there could be a miraculous intervention right there. And who knows? The supernatural can step in at any time, and our faith is deepened right in that moment. So we're all praying for that, right? But my experience with shame is it's a journey. Like, I have been on this journey for a long, long time, and it hasn't been till the last couple of years that I've seen some major breakthrough in my life. So I say that to encourage each and every one of you, because there's been points in my life where I was stuck. I felt trapped. And I still struggle with it. I mean, yesterday we had a family outing, and I found myself rehearsing some of my hurts and leaning over all my wounds. And I had an interesting kind of vision a while back, and it was before Andrew even started this whole message, but I felt it was his prayers leaning into us, that the Lord was preparing us for his message. And I felt like I was leaning over a big rock pile of rubble, and each one spoke out my shame. I felt like I needed to be there, like I had to be there. But then I turned my head, and there's Jesus with his hand out to me, calling me to him, saying, give those up. I realized it was my choice to do that. And it was really a moment of clarity for me to say, I don't have to nurse my hurts. I don't have to feed my wounds. That's not something I have to do. That's my shame telling me that to keep me stuck. But Jesus is saying, I've climbed over hill and high water for you. I died for you. And I'm standing right here. It's just a matter of turning your head. So.
Thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. Yeah, I think something to keep in mind in the process of healing, of any kind of healing, we're invited to have a faith that can move mountains. But also, I think that we are invited to have a faithfulness that it might take 1,000 years sometimes. And so in that, many of us have experienced healings that were instantaneous, and that we've never come back to that issue. Maybe it was a physical issue, maybe it was an emotional issue. There are all kinds of issues where many of us have experienced instant healing, and that drives our faith forward, and that's fantastic. But also, many of us have had ongoing struggles with all sorts of different processes of healing. And so in that, there's an invitation to faith, and also an invitation into faithfulness. One of the things we were talking about in the last service, too, was the importance of, if we as the church, and by that I don't just mean neighborhood church, I mean a sense of the universal church, want to get serious about healing, we're going to also have to get ready for the mess, because it's messy. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the time we are very uncomfortable when things get messy. And we can even shame in the midst of the mess. I've had friends told before. I had a friend a few years ago who was told that he had pneumonia for 3 weeks because if he had had more faithfulness, it would have only lasted a day. And so, right, and it came from a desire in that person not to condemn or to shame him, but to invite him into faith. But she wasn't realizing that what she was doing was actually shaming him in that process. And that actually was a struggle for a long time for him because he was really wondering, wow, is this God doing this to me because I don't have enough faith? And so we need to be really careful of the mess, but also recognizing that in the midst of other people's shame, that might trigger shame in us as well. And if only we were talking last service about, if only we had like a spider sense for when triggers were going to come, then we could think about what we were going to do beforehand. But a lot of times it's in the moment. So what do we do after the fact, after a trigger has taken place, whether we are experiencing shame in that moment or somebody else's story is triggering us in some way. So anyways.
Yeah. And as you realize, oh, wow, this is what's happening, that's when you need to invite in someone else and say, this is how I'm feeling, will you help me process, right? That's the beginning of confession. Just, I know that there's something going on inside me that's triggering, and I may not even understand what the root of it is, but I know I need help because we're not created to walk alone. We're created to walk in community.
I wanted to say something because I think some people might be a little bit uncomfortable in that it might have sounded a little bit like we disagreed with each other.
You didn't?
Because I said no and they said yes. And I just wanted to say that I'm in full agreement with everything they
That's right.
said because we get victory in the battles and we have another battle.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. No, I don't need it. I've got one of these. I want to make sure we talk a little bit about parenting. We've had quite a few questions about parenting. Thank you guys so much for your great questions. I don't know whether to cry or pray or preach or die right here, right now. This is a lot right here. So thank you for being vulnerable and putting those out there. Parenting without shaming. Is there some tips? How can we interrupt our pattern of shaming kids? What does it look like to work to restore maybe the harm without using shame as a motivator? Because shame, we know, is a really clean way to get people to do things that we want them to do. There's whole cultures that rely on shame at keeping everyone doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's effective parenting, but we know it destroys identity. So can we talk about parenting for a few minutes? And all the parents are
What I love
convicted.
about that question is that parents, you're starting with yourself. You're starting at the home base and you're questioning from you. Like, what can I do to change this up because it's not working out? And shame's a great motivator. I mean, you know, you throw that out there and nobody wants to be shamed. Nobody really wants to do anything wrong. But love is a long-term motivator. And so I think, I can't remember who it was, but I heard this, is that if you want to start changing anything, you draw a circle on the ground and you get right in the middle of it and you start within the middle of it. Meaning start with yourself. Like, what is going on in me that I am calling out shame in someone else? Because I don't want to do that, and especially not to my precious child. And then remember, and we've been talking about identity, whose child are we? Above the fact that I'm my mom's child, I'm the child of God. And so therefore, he's calling me out of shame because he's telling me that I'm awesome. And you know, I have a hard time believing that, but the Lord wants to restore that for all of us. So if we're struggling in our parenting, I love that you start with yourself and you start to take a look within and say, what is driving me to that place? Because I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to be that kind of parent.
And to follow you as well, I am not a parent, but I have parents, so I don't know if that gives me any credibility. But I have worked with parents as a marriage and family therapist, and some of the things that I think are so important for parents to check in with, for us all to check in with, so this is across the board, but is what values do we have? And is the person in front of us less valuable because maybe they don't share the values that we have? And we are so different. My parents are amazing. I am so different than they are. And so a lot of the, just personality-wise, was often not seen as beautiful differences, but more so there's something wrong with you because you're not like me. And of course, I get to extend that too and work on my own shame that comes from that. And so I think for parents, whether it's, I mean, it's a different generation that they, kids have different things these days. I wasn't even raised in the total cell phone generation, so I'm not entirely understand that. But I know, speaking with a lot of teenagers, that is really the way that they feel connected in ways that I don't. And so I think, one, recognizing that our values come from something. They come from, this is what my mom said a good girl was and a good boy. They did these things. You work hard, that makes you a good person. And so I think recognizing that those that we're teaching are not us. And so to make sure we're checking in with what are my values and how am I parenting through, in that, friends and kids alike, there's something wrong with you, or am I actually going, we might be different and I might need to enforce some boundaries because that's not the best way potentially to go through life, and I've got some wisdom in this area, but I have to be really careful that I don't think there's something wrong with you because your room's messy or your car's not clean, which is still one I get today. Always checking in on my car. Still not clean if you guys want to check it out. But it's true. So yeah.
I was just going to say, my parenting changed when I read a book by Ted Tripp called Shepherding a Child's Heart. And I don't remember much from the book, but what I remember was him talking about what is your motivation? Is your motivation to change your child's behavior so that you're more comfortable or so that you're not embarrassed? Or is your motivation to change their heart? Because if their heart and their behavior is not matching up, i.e. if you've changed their behavior but nothing has changed in their heart, what you've just done is created a hypocrite. And that became my guiding statement for my parenting, and that became the check. Why do I want their behavior to change? And that when I am embarrassed about my child's behavior, there's some shame coming up that I need to deal with in me, so that I can speak identity to them.
So can I ask, give us a couple practical examples of what shame-based parenting, if you will, would be. I wish you were more like your brother, right?
I'll share one of my worst ones.
Okay, that'd be great.
That'd be good? So, I'm kind of a perfectionist, and I see the stuff that's wrong. Like, that just shows up. So when my kid comes home with a 93%, I would go, what'd you miss? I was just curious what they still needed to learn. Shamed. And so I had kids that were great students that didn't feel like I was proud of them because my first response was looking at what was missing and what was lacking. So learning to turn that around into, I don't really need to know that. I need to give them identity.
I think it can look like this, are you going to wear that? Are you wearing that sweatshirt again? Your hair, you name it, that can be shame-based. And, kind of using a really heavy upper hand without really giving them an opportunity to kind of be part of the parenting, which I know, I'm a mom. It's not always easy. And I find myself sometimes calling things out that I quickly want to reel right back in because I don't mean it that way. And so one of the best things I think we can do with our children is to say, sorry, I messed up, and please, 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 and this is a modeling, please forgive me, because I'm only human. I don't know how many times I've had to tell my son, I'm messed up. And, he kind of looks at me like, maybe rolls his eyes, he's 13, but I know between me and God, there's a lot of reparation in that, and I'm so, so grateful for that we have that to lean back on and to say, look, I messed up, but I love you more than ever, so bear with me.
You always, you never. Those are probably words you want to strike from your vocabulary, not only in your marriage, but also with your kids, right? Those are shame-inducing. Anytime you're trying to get, like Bernita said, their behavior to change with very little to no regard for their heart to understand the reason for the change, all you're doing is sowing seeds of rebellion later for them.
And
because you're teaching them to live in a hypocritical place.
Also, the word should can be really, really negative. It puts a lot of pressure on people. I like to think of what will they do and what won't they do. Like, let's give them an opportunity to figure that out for themselves. Shoulds, I know on me, I try not to live under those anymore. Because when somebody calls that out, it feels really oppressive.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, I'm not a parent also yet, but we're not there yet. But I do think that parenting mirrors, it's a form of leadership, as it were. And so whatever role of leadership you have, I think these things are applicable. And we've been talking about some of the problems that come from using shame as a form of leadership to motivate change, whether as a parent or as a pastor or even as a friend. And we've been talking about some of the destructive factors in that, and we've also been talking about some specifics as to how that might play out. But also one thing to keep in mind is that I think there's a number of things that motivate us to use shame to control or to try and incite change or to change somebody's behavior or affect someone. One of them is that it's what we know. It's much of the way that we've been raised or that we've experienced social life. It's a way that we've learned where the lines are not to cross. I personally am one of the fortunate few that didn't experience a lot of shame in my household, but I experienced a lot in my social life growing up. And so I remember kindergarten being where I have a distinct memory of the first time I experienced a really shameful message. And it's oftentimes, even as parents, I think innocent. It's what you know, it's what's familiar to you. So be careful even right now as we're talking about this, not to be like, oh man, I totally do that. And you're just sitting, you're just ducking down because you want to hide a little bit because of shame. It's innate to us. This is natural for us. I shouldn't say innate, that's not right. It's learned by us. It's not innate, but it's learned by us. Much of this means of motivating change through shaming is just because of familiarity. It's what we know. Another reason that it's common in our leadership styles, again, as pastors, parents, friends, what have you, is because it's efficient. It's probably the most efficient way to change somebody's behavior is to shame them. At least they won't do it around you anymore, which is most of what you want. But the problem, once they get to college, whatever. Just kidding. But the problem with that is that shame, because it's an antipathy, because it's a message of anti-love, it doesn't actually train the heart to love what's good. The goal of leadership for any good leader is to train people to love the good, to know how to act on the good, and then to enjoy having acted on the good. This is how the church fathers and church mothers talked about it. Shame is a way to get somebody to act like they love the good, but not actually love it. And as long as they're within a community that will maintain that shame base, then we will maintain the behavior that makes us feel like we're doing the right thing. But as soon as we get out of that, well, we've never learned to love the good. We've never learned to actually see what's good, feel free to choose what's good, which is itself a message of Christ. And this could all come back around to our relationship with God, which was asked earlier. Well, how does God parent you? How does God parent you? One of the things that we as a community might need to come in contact with, especially as we begin to step into the mess of shame, is that for many of us, we really do believe, or at least we intuit, that God motivates us through condemnation and through fear of him, and through anxiety about him, and through shame, and through guilt, when in fact God is the antidote to these very things. He's the freedom that we step into. He's the one who steps into the shame, takes it on himself, and invites us into his process of love and freedom. And that love is not a wishy-washy idea. It's potency, it's power, it's the way that somebody can speak the truth to you, and it makes a difference all of a sudden. Instead of just getting the behavior change without actually affecting the person's heart. Well, it'll affect their heart, but in a broken way. Yeah. And so, but even now, as we're talking about this, don't go, oh, crud. Like, what are all the ways that I've ruined my friends' lives or my kids' lives or whatever? It starts with recognizing these things and going, I want to get freedom from this too. Yeah,
that's right. That's excellent. Thanks, Scott. So for me, what I'm learning in my own parenting is that it's easy to slip into shame, and when it becomes more about me than about my child learning something and growing, and then there's a problem, right? If you do this, you're making me so late. It may be true that they're making you late, but all you're doing is just using that as a club to beat them up. So that's the selfishness test. That seems to be working just fine for me. I'm finding all sorts of areas where I fall down in that one. So we are running late on time here. We had, I think, between 55 and 60 questions between the two services. So sorry if we didn't get to your question. We tried to group those up. We'll also be doing some writing on this coming out of this. My smart friends here, who are incredible, can help me do that because I can only do so much. But one clarification here. What's the line look like between shame and healthy ownership of a mistake? Because I think it'd be easy to listen to this and say, oh, they're just going soft on sin. By the way, I talked about that last week. You can listen to the podcast. Some of the questions actually that you're asking, you may have missed that week's or not heard kind of what we said about it. But there is a real importance to owning our stuff and being broken before God and being vulnerable in front of others. And so there is a healthy ownership that is absolutely necessary. Do not just think that we're just doing some touchy-feely, ooey-gooey, we just want to make everybody feel good. This is not about singing Kumbaya. This is about learning to grow together, and a piece of confronting and hearing someone's shame story is still saying, okay, I hear you, I love you, I'm with you, I'll be with you in it, but stop doing that. Stop destroying yourself. Sin leads to death. So there is a truth-telling that's absolutely critical. And it's not shaming, it's truth-telling, speaking the truth in love. I think Karma did a great job talking about that earlier. So any final thoughts on that as far as shame versus healthy ownership? Did I do okay? Do we need to say more?
Can I say one thing about it? Shame, what I found out this year, which I didn't really realize, but I had been practicing quite a bit. Shame tells you you're bad. At your core, you're bad. You're bad, you're bad. Now, guilt is a little different because it's more of a motivator. It says, oh, gosh, I feel kind of bad. I did something bad, which is not a defining of who you are. In fact, that can be worked with. So when you really start at your core thinking you're bad, you're inherently terrible, you can't, you're just terribly bad, that is shame right all over it. And that's Satan's stronghold on your life to say, you are bad. Why even try to be better?
And on that really quick, also shame, I think a really good way to tell that you're operating in shame is you will feel powerless. And so even if you're super angry, you will feel powerless in that, or if you're the victim, you'll feel powerless in that, or if you're trying to rescue someone, you can feel powerless in that. That's if you guys look that up, the old victim triangle. And so, but all of those places, you're going to be responding from shame. And you're not going to feel powerful. Whereas if you've got like a guilt response, you have something to work with. You can go like, man, I gotta say sorry. But if you're going either you're bad or I'm bad, you can't take ownership in that place. Either it has to be a bad guy, and it's going to be you or someone else. And so just to I think it's helpful to recognize if you feel really powerless, you're probably operating in some sort of shame.
I need to finish my circle.
Finish it.
I talked about the anger silence thing with my husband, and when something doesn't resolve in that first conversation, you don't just walk away from it. So yes, in that we continued pressing into it until we figured out what it was that we needed to do about when I expressed anger, that I needed feedback, and that also my recognition that when I express anger, he freezes. So I need to understand that he's working through his stuff too. So in that, in a marriage, it's one kind of working through it because we have that commitment. But then when you're sitting in a congregation with people who you have the interaction and it gets uncomfortable and you feel the freedom to walk away, but we are called to love one another and we are called to keep pressing into that. And so just that we need to keep at it until our relationships bring us into a place of unity, and that we need to be real here so that we can glorify God out there. and not be fake here and go out there and expose our shame. We need to be real so that God is glorified.
So, thank you, panel, for all your work. These guys will be down here, down front, if you want to come and talk to them, have them pray for you. This is a deep hole. This topic is like Alice in Wonderland. You just keep falling and falling and falling. There's just so many pieces to it. So, is it confusing? Yes. Is it going to remain confusing? Yes. Why? Because the enemy of your soul is trying to make it confusing. He doesn't want you to get clear on this. He does not want you to work and talk to other people. He does not want you to be vulnerable. He does not want you to have healthy boundaries in the midst of it. He wants you to be completely stuck where you are, and this is an incredible threat to his kingdom. We recognize that. That's why we're doing it. So stand up with us. Want to pray for you and invite the prayer folks to come forward. We'd love to pray for you, not just for this area, but for any area that you'd like prayer for, physical, emotional, spiritual, financial help. Thank you, Veronica, for your help. Appreciate you wrangling the questions. So, Lord, I pray that you would powerfully remind us of how loved we are by you, how accepted we are by you, and how much you love us. And may we reflect that love in beautiful ways to the people sitting across the table from us that are broken just like we are. I pray, Lord, that you would make us more and more aware of where we're triggered and where we go to a shame response. We pray, Lord, that you would bring your truth and your truth would set us free. And I pray, God, that as we step into more and more a healthy place, God, that you would just unlock the doors of heaven and pour out your love on us. Help us to understand how loved we are so that we can give that love away to others too. And thank you for just the willingness of my friends to share today in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.